Have you ever noticed how the quietest child in the room is often the one carrying the heaviest burden? The one who always sits politely, never interrupts, never asks for too much, and always follows the rules. On the surface, they seem like a parent's dream, a teacher's pride, the model of discipline and obedience. But beneath that calm exterior, there is often a silent ache, a hidden pain that rarely gets noticed because it hides behind smiles, nods, and the word yes. And the truth is, what looks like perfect behavior in childhood often leaves behind scars that are difficult to explain. This is the story of the obedient child, not just the child you might remember from your past, but the child that still lives in so many adults today. Every child is born with raw impulses, natural emotions, unfiltered desires. They want to cry when they feel hurt, laugh when they feel joy, run when they feel energy, and resist when something doesn't feel right. But what happens when a child quickly realizes that their laughter is too loud, their questions are too many, their tears are inconvenient, and their resistance is met with silence or disapproval? Because when a child learns to be too obedient, too accommodating, too good, they are often trading pieces of their authentic self for the approval of others. And the cost of that trade can last a lifetime. Think about it. Slowly they learn to tame themselves. They learn to swap authenticity for acceptance. And that's where the hidden pain begins. Psychologists have long spoken about something called conditional love. It is the kind of love that feels available only when you behave in the right way. Many obedient children grow up in environments where they believe love and safety are dependent on compliance. They learn to read the room better than most adults, to anticipate what others need, and to adjust themselves accordingly. And while this may sound like maturity, what it often creates is a lifelong pattern of self-suppression. Here's the part that many people miss. Obedience in a child isn't always a sign of health. Sometimes it's a survival strategy, a way of ensuring that they won't be abandoned, rejected, or criticized. It's as if the child silently tells themselves, if I am good enough, quiet enough, helpful enough, maybe then I'll be loved. Now pause for a moment and think about the adult version of this child. Maybe you know them. Maybe you are them. The adult who struggles to say no. The person who always takes on extra work even when exhausted. The friend who listens endlessly but rarely shares their own struggles. The partner who tries to avoid conflict at all costs. These are often the hidden faces of the once obedient child. But why is this so painful? Why does being good, being compliant, carry such a heavy cost? The answer lies in something called authenticity loss. Human beings are wired for expression. We are meant to cry, to argue, to laugh, to play, to question. When those impulses are repeatedly suppressed, the self fragments. The outer self becomes polished, agreeable, and composed. The inner self becomes muted, silenced, sometimes even forgotten. And over time, that inner voice whispers less and less, until the person doesn't quite know who they are outside of pleasing others. I want to ask you a question. Have you ever wondered why so many adults struggle with identity, purpose, or self-worth? Could it be that their earliest lessons weren't about discovering who they were, but about shaping themselves into who others needed them to be? That's the silent inheritance of the obedient child. And here's something fascinating. Research in developmental psychology shows that children who are excessively obedient often score lower on measures of self-esteem later in life. Why? Because they were never given the space to build an identity separate from compliance. They were rewarded for erasing parts of themselves, not for discovering them. But let's go deeper. Imagine a child who desperately wants to draw in bright colors, but is told to stay inside the lines. Imagine a child who wants to ask why the sky is blue, but is silenced because the question is inconvenient. Imagine a child who wants to say, I'm sad, but instead smiles because sadness is not welcomed. Over time, that child learns that self-expression is unsafe, and what's unsafe becomes buried. But buried feelings don't disappear. They transform, sometimes into anxiety, sometimes into perfectionism, sometimes into a deep sense of emptiness that even achievements cannot fill. This is the paradox of obedience. Society praises it, parents showcase it, teachers reward it, but rarely do we pause to ask, what did that child have to sacrifice to be so good? Now let's open a curiosity loop here, because the obedient child grows up believing that their worth is tied to performance, to helpfulness, to harmony. But what happens when the adult version of this child finally encounters a moment where obedience is no longer enough? What happens when they follow all the rules at work but still get overlooked? When they give endlessly in relationships but still feel unloved? When they remain quiet in friendships but still feel invisible? That's when the hidden pain surfaces. That's when the cracks begin to show. See, the story of the obedient child is not about childhood alone. It is about how early patterns echo through adulthood. It is about how silence turns into people-pleasing, how compliance turns into burnout, and how the quest for approval turns into a lifelong battle with self-worth. And yet, here's the most striking part. Many obedient children don't even realize the weight they're carrying, because to them, obedience is not a choice. It's an identity. It feels natural, automatic. They don't even recognize how much of themselves they've lost along the way. But let's not mistake this for hopelessness, because within the hidden pain lies a hidden strength. The obedient child learns empathy, sensitivity, awareness. They can read emotions, they can hold space, they can bring harmony into chaos. These are powerful gifts, but the challenge is this: will those gifts always come at the cost of their own soul? Or can they learn to balance obedience with authenticity, kindness with boundaries, harmony with truth? The obedient child's journey is ultimately about reclaiming voice, about rediscovering that their value doesn't depend on constant compliance, but on their inherent worth as a human being. And this realization is not just healing, it is revolutionary. Because when an obedient child finally learns to speak their truth, they don't just free themselves, they free generations that come after them. But here's where we go even deeper. Why does society reward obedience so heavily in the first place? Why do we smile at the quiet child and frown at the loud one? Why do we prize the easy student and label the spirited one as difficult? Could it be that we, as a culture, are more comfortable with compliance than with authenticity? That we would rather raise children who fit neatly into systems than children who challenge and disrupt? And if that's the case, then maybe the pain of the obedient child isn't just personal. Maybe it's cultural. Maybe it's the echo of a society that values order more than individuality, performance more than presence, silence more than voice. I want to leave you with this question for now, and we'll return to it in the next part. What happens to a world full of adults who were once obedient children? Adults who know how to conform, how to please, how to hide, but who never truly learned how to be. So let's return to that question. What happens to a world full of adults who were once obedient children? Adults who learned early on that being good meant being quiet, that pleasing others was safer than being true to themselves, and that love was something earned rather than something freely given. The answer is all around us. It shows up in workplaces where people silently endure jobs that drain them, too afraid to speak up or step away. It shows up in relationships where one partner gives and gives, hoping their sacrifices will finally be enough to secure love, while their own needs remain invisible. It shows up in friendships where someone always listens but rarely feels heard, always comforts but rarely receives comfort. At first glance, these adults seem dependable, reliable, selfless, but if you look closer, you'll notice the weariness in their eyes, the quiet resentment that builds silently, the longing to finally be seen not just for what they do, but for who they are. And here's the truth, this hidden pain often goes unnoticed because obedient adults rarely make noise. They rarely demand, they rarely disrupt, but inside they carry a silent fatigue, the exhaustion of living a life that feels more like performance than authenticity. Now let's pause and look at this through psychology. Research in developmental psychology and attachment theory shows us that children who adapt too much to the needs of their environment often develop what's called a false self. The false self is like a mask. It is polished, agreeable, and acceptable to others, but it hides the authentic self underneath. Over time, this false self becomes so practiced that the person almost forgets who they truly are. But the authentic self doesn't disappear. It waits, often in silence, for moments of expression. Sometimes it breaks through in unexpected ways, in art, in sudden bursts of emotion, in quiet rebellion. Sometimes it waits for years until adulthood offers enough safety to finally risk being real. And this raises a profound question. How do you rediscover your authentic self after years, maybe decades, of obedience? The first step is awareness, to recognize that what feels like natural compliance might actually be conditioning, to notice the moments when you say yes while your heart is screaming no, to notice the tension between what you show the world and what you feel inside. This awareness is not easy because it often brings grief for the childhood where your feelings were muted, grief for the relationships where you never felt fully yourself, grief for the years spent living as a shadow of who you might have been. But grief, as painful as it is also cleansing. It creates space for something new. The second step is permission, giving yourself permission to exist outside of others' expectations, permission to rest even when there's work to do, permission to say no even when someone else wants a yes, permission to express feelings that are messy, inconvenient, or vulnerable. This permission is the beginning of reclaiming the self that obedience once buried. And then comes courage, because choosing authenticity is not always easy. Sometimes it disappoints people, sometimes it creates conflict, sometimes it challenges systems that depend on compliance. But here's the paradox. Only through that courage can you discover relationships, careers, and communities that love you, not for your obedience, but for your truth. But let's step back for a moment. Why is this conversation important for all of us, even if you don't see yourself as an obedient child? Because society is built on the backs of obedient adults. Our systems, schools, workplaces, even families, often rely on people who quietly follow, who adjust, who suppress. And yet, the greatest innovations, the most profound art, the most meaningful social change has always come from those who dared to break out of obedience. This is why the hidden pain of the obedient child matters, because if we do not see it, if we do not name it, we risk raising generation after generation of adults who can function, who can comply, but who never truly live. And here's where hope enters. The obedient child is not doomed to remain hidden forever. Many adults who once carried this silent pain eventually begin to awaken. Sometimes it happens in therapy, sometimes through a supportive friend or partner, sometimes through art, writing, or spiritual exploration. And sometimes it begins with something as simple as asking yourself, what do I really want? What do I really feel? What would I do if I stopped trying to be good and started trying to be real? These questions can feel terrifying at first, but they are also liberating. They begin to peel away the layers of obedience to reveal a self that has been waiting patiently underneath. Let me share a thought experiment. Imagine a child who never had to earn love by being obedient. Imagine a child who could express sadness without fear, joy without shame, anger without rejection. What kind of adult would they become? Likely someone with a strong sense of self, someone able to balance kindness with boundaries, someone unafraid to challenge and create. Now imagine if we, as adults, could give that kind of space to ourselves, to reparent the obedient child within us, to whisper, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to always say yes. You are worthy simply because you exist. This shift is not just personal, it is cultural, because every time one obedient child turned adult chooses authenticity, they give permission for others to do the same. They model a new way of being, one where love is not earned through compliance, but shared through truth. And maybe this is the hidden gift inside the hidden pain, that those who know the cost of obedience also know the value of freedom, that those who once silenced themselves can one day become the fiercest advocates for voice, not only for themselves but for others. But let's not pretend this is easy. Breaking patterns of obedience can feel like betrayal. Betrayal of family expectations, of cultural norms, of ingrained beliefs. Yet what feels like betrayal at first often reveals itself as liberation, because the greatest loyalty we can offer is not to the masks we wear, but to the truth of who we are. So let me leave you with this thought. If you were once the obedient child, your pain is real, but it is not the end of your story. Beneath the obedience lies sensitivity, empathy, and strength. Beneath the silence lies a voice that deserves to be heard, and beneath the hidden pain lies the possibility of a new beginning, one where your worth is no longer tied to how well you obey, but to how fully you live. And if you are raising or mentoring children now, remember this: the goal is not perfect obedience. The goal is not a child who never argues, never questions, never resists. The goal is a child who feels safe enough to be themselves, because that child will grow into an adult who doesn't carry hidden pain, but who carries the light of authenticity into a world that desperately needs it. The obedient child may have been quiet, but their story is not. Their story is the story of countless adults learning, slowly, courageously, to step out of the shadows and into the fullness of who they are. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all, that true goodness is not found in obedience, but in authenticity. That true love is not earned, but given, and that the most obedient child can one day become the most authentic adult, if they are brave enough to reclaim themselves.